I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk, where we take a unique view of world events. We report news as history. With me today is the editor of StrategyPage.com and well-known military author, Jim Dunnigan. Associate editor and syndicated columnist Austin Bay also joins us.
Welcome, Austin and Jim. Austin, you had written an article on Daniel Coates's 5 major functional threats. Could you go into that a little bit?
Well, Dan, it was really a column on the Director of National Intelligence's worldwide threat assessment. The DNI is Dan Coates, and he recently testified before the Senate Intelligence Committee. Understand that this is a combined project to produce this worldwide threat. It has all the major U.S. intelligence agencies involved: CIA, DIA, NSA, FBI, and then what's NGA now, National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, really used to be the National Reconnaissance Office. And they produce a worldwide threat assessment. And I think it's a worthwhile information project, the open source document that they produce. And anyway, I listened to his testimony. And he covered a number of hot spots, but he said there are basically 5, what he called them, functional areas where we face threats. And he starts out with, and I'll just go through the list. Cyber activity, including spying, propaganda, attacks directed by nation states, non-state actors, and criminal groups. He labeled that number 1. Then second was weapons of mass destruction and proliferation and weapons of mass destruction delivery systems, terrorism. Then he said technological threats from space and in space, which is something I really want to hear Jim talk about. And finally, transnational crime. So it's cyber threats, WMD, terrorism, technological threats from space and in space, and transnational crime. So I guess today we're going to try to talk about all 5 in some way.
Okay, Jim, could you address the cyber threat?
Well, yeah, we've been covering that, since the beginning. In fact, I did a book back in, I think it was 02 or 03, The Next War Zone, which basically every once in a while I go back and check it. Nothing has changed. I mean, we're essentially facing the same threats, which come down to, zero-day exploits. In other words, flaws in the online software that most people, except for a few, are not aware of, and how those can be exploited. The problem is the offense has a much bigger advantage than the defense. The offense basically goes looking for these zero-day exploits, and then builds an attack strategy. Now, we haven't seen a major application of this to a major economy, but we've seen it applied to smaller economies, and it can do a lot of damage. The problem we have with this, as with all these threats, is that the news media, and to a certain extent the government, relies a lot on FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, to get money, to get support, to deal with the threat. The American intelligence agencies, at least in peacetime, and again, I was reporting on this even before Strategy Page, started, as an on-air, expert, as it were. And I kept pointing out, as we do now, it's all well and good, but what are you going to do about it? And we've seen, from, the recent history, we had Obama in for 8 years, and he cut back on a lot of stuff, and stuff went wrong, and he blamed somebody else and threw the FUD around. It's like passing a football around. Nobody wants to hold it and do anything with it. And now we have Trump, and before that we had Bush, et cetera, et cetera. It seems everybody, this is the ball. They say, oh, yeah, we got a threat. Well, what are you going to do about it? endlessly repeats itself. Yes, there's a threat. Yes, there are people, there are countries, there are in the United States, there are organizations that can protect themselves. There are things you can do. There are countries. Israel, for example, has been under more attack than probably anybody else, and they have defended themselves, but we haven't. And so that's the question you have to ask. All we're getting from, Mr. Coates is a lot of bromides and empty words. But yeah, there's a threat. No problem there. But what's the solution? There doesn't seem to be any in the United States. We're, vulnerable, and that seems to suit Mr. Coates just fine because it means we're.
Austin, do you want to respond to that and then talk a little bit about WMD?
The question of cooperation and cyber defense is one that actually has some constitutional dimensions in the U.S. because there are a lot of people that are, I think, with good reason, afraid of being spied upon by not simply North Korea or a criminal organization, but U.S. government security agencies breaking constitutional violations. And there should be and could be more cooperation, but there's been a lack of trust. A little of that showed up, Dan, in some of the question and answers that went on after Coates' testimony. I understand you had the director of FBI, CIA, DIA, NSA, the geospatial agency up there as well. So they didn't testify, but they answered questions. And what Jim said about actually doing something came out indirectly. You could see that we've understood that we've been under attack for a long time. And Jim suggests that Coates was grandstanding. To some degree, he was. He says, America's under attack, as if that was news. Well, I remember doing something, reading something that Jim wrote about the time Next War Zone came out. They said that has the cyber war begun? Well, yeah, and it began a while ago, but are we prepared to make some of the sacrifices and put the money into the efforts to defend ourselves? And he said it extremely well too, that in cyber offense has the advantage over the defense. I'll make a couple of other comments, though, about the situation. There seem to be more bad actors and malign actors out there now, and they seem better organized. And that's, you think of examples of that, China's hacker brigades, and also the Chinese, which is something we've written about on and discussed on strategy page. The Chinese operate a cyber operation where they are probing not just for national secrets, but for commercial secrets and commercial proprietary information from American companies. And then they end up with that ends up being passed on to Chinese corporations, Chinese commercial entities. You want me to go ahead and move on to WMD?
Yeah.
Or does Jim have a comment on that?
No. Go ahead.
All right. The WMD, weapons of mass destruction. Well, they've been a threat for a long time as well. North Korea is what the intelligence community says is the most immediate threat. And if you see what goes on, the way the news media covers it, what we know to be the intentions, known intentions of North Korea, and it is a crisis coming to a head, and it involves nuclear weapons. Now, Jim and I see North Korea slightly differently. Jim sees North Korea as primarily attached to the greater China problem. I agree with that. I just see that North Korea has its own goals that can be differentiated from China. It wants its own nuclear weapon. The regime is designed, nuclear weapons, I should say. The regime believes, the Kim regime believes that it must have nuclear weapons in order to survive, because the rest of their society is such a mess. They have to rely on what it says, a decisive military weapon. They want ICBMs, so they can not only threaten Seoul and Tokyo, but threaten the United States. And they see South Korea, to flip the view here, South Korea and Japan as being fronts for the United States. Why, if the United States hadn't intervened in 1950, the Kim regime would control the entire Korean Peninsula. And here I'm talking about the WMD threat in a nation-state situation. The Coates' testimony and also the threat assessment, which I went ahead and read, starts to move from not just nation-states who are modernizing their nuclear arsenals, and that touches on Russia, and the U.S. nuclear arsenal is in need of modernization, but into non-state actors that are still interested in acquiring nuclear weapons, Al-Qaeda primarily, but also chemical weapons and potentially biological weapons. Remains a threat. Have we done something about it? Yes, but have we done enough? Take a look at what we're able to do, what North Korea is able to do by just introducing the threat of having a nuclear weapon, an ICBM that can hit Seattle. So, genuine threat, yes. Are we behind on defensive systems? There's a weak analog here to the way Jim discussed cyber, and that is that the offense in WMD has an advantage over the defense. At least in missile-delivered nuclear weapons at this time. It's still tough to shoot that bullet with a bullet, which is the way to express knocking down an incoming enemy warhead from a ballistic missile with an anti-ballistic missile. So you've got non-state actors and state actors involved in the WMD threat.
You've got another problem with that, and we point this out in the strategy page all the time. What are Kim's real options? If he uses it, he's dead. He's a pariah. First of all, the reliability of his weapon systems, again, comparing it with what we actually know from Soviet-era systems, which a lot of them are based upon, is not 100%. But he's got problems both with the missile and with the warhead, which hasn't been tested yet. We have defensive systems. They do work. We've knocked missile systems down with several of our anti-missile systems. So we have defensive systems that have shown that they work. He has an offensive system, which he has very few of. He hasn't got the wherewithal to basically build, dozens of quasi-reliable, systems, missiles, long-range missiles with these warheads, so that he could, be assured of penetrating our defenses. And if he does penetrate our defenses, he's defenseless against the counterforce. Now, he may think in his deranged mind that, they won't use a nuclear weapon on me. I mean, we're poor and we're starving. We need food aid. Yada, yada, yada. So I'm simply pointing out, what's the strategy here? He's playing games. They have been playing games for over 50 years. I was over in Korea in the early 60s, so I remember that vividly. And even then, nobody took him seriously. Said, what are these guys, deranged? And of course, after the Cold War ended, it came out, it was Stalin who basically set up the Kim family in the first place, who ordered him, in so many words, to invade. He said, hey, it'll be easy. They won't do anything. Maybe that might have worked in another world where the Russians hadn't stomped out of the UN right at the time that the invasion came, and the UN, in one of the few times in its history, said that's wrong. We condemn you. Russia's veto, wasn't able to go into action. And America, probably would have come to the aid of the South Koreans anyway. We had left because we felt, hey, peace in our time and all that. There's no threat up in North Korea. And then the Chinese were basically, that's one reason why the Chinese to this day are not very happy about the Russians. The Russians pointed out, well, they're your problem now. Why don't you go in there and lose 500,000 of your troops? Fighting the Americans and all their technology, and basically the rest of the United Nations. So, where is the plan here? What exactly does Kim expect to have happen? He basically feeds on attention. He's basically playing an elaborate, scam. He's a grifter, just like his father and his grandfather were. And that happens again and again and again. You give him something, he changes the rules. he basically he cheats. He did it with Clinton in the 90s when they made a deal. and eventually, not too long after that, he said, oh, by the way, in the fine print it says I can do this. Instead of that, where's all my goodies? So, you have to basically take a realistic look at what's going on here, and not the version that sells newspapers.
Well, the grifter regime, though, is acquiring nukes, and one of the things that the grifter regime might do, and I should have made this point, again, it's something that we've discussed before, is selling the nuclear technology to other organizations, whether they're non-state actors or indications that the Kim regime has cooperated with Iran. I didn't mention Iran. Iran got some mention as a threat with WMDs, and certainly Israel and Saudi Arabia believe that to be the case. So that's it's
yeah, but wait a minute. We've gone into this in strategy page. It's not the technology. It's not the stuff you can put on a flash drive, which we know the Khan network in Pakistan was selling all over the place. Of course, technically he was doing it privately, but that's a whole other story. That you could sell the technology. In fact, the technology for a fission type bomb is basically an open secret. The problem is the engineering. You need the engineering capabilities, or somebody who's willing to basically sell you bomb components, which are fairly obvious. And nobody's been willing to do that. They've gotten some people have gotten some of the components and what have you. But Pakistan basically had enough trained engineers, had enough industry and what have you, to manufacture those, WMD components and build and then test, along with India, a nuclear bomb. North Korea has done it. They've finally done it. They've conducted 6 tests, but it's basically a shabby bomb. And I should point out something else. Yes, well, WMDs have been used. There was a group of radical Buddhists. Believe it, this is real. The Aum Shinrikyo in Tokyo that attracted a lot of fairly well-educated people, and they made nerve gas. And they set it loose in the Tokyo subway in the 90s, I believe it was. And bingo, all of a sudden they were all in jail. Yes, it can happen. But if a nation state does it, it's much more dangerous to the government there and all the people living there and the people living in the vicinity. The Chinese take this seriously. They've been issuing radiation warnings to people along the North Korean border, not about North Korean fallout, but the fallout from our retaliation if the North Koreans do something. So there's no doubt that you got a madman there who's saying, I will. But what's the intelligence agency telling us that we don't already know?
Oh, they're not. They're telling us. Describing threats is what they were. To some people, the news media that is constantly deplored on strategy talk. It's like news to them, but it's not. You want to move on to terrorism, Dan?
Yeah, Jim. Yeah. Could you address terrorism for us?
Well, terrorism is basically the same thing. I'll never forget after we're up the anniversary, 25th anniversary, I guess it is, of that the first attack on the World Trade Center. And after that, they asked me, well, could this happen again? I said, well, it could if the intelligence agencies don't do their job. Well, guess what happened? Prophets get no respect. It was the same thing with the end of the Cold War. And even, I think it was the second edition of How to Make War. I had a section on the Soviet Union, which was contentious down in Langley. I mean, there were a lot of people that never agree with me, but that was not the majority opinion. That says the numbers do not add up. Any financial analyst can look at this and say, look, these people, from all that we know, and of course the people at the agency, at least the ones, the true believers, who were reporting what they were asked to report. And I went to a couple of conferences down there. He says, well, I can't go into detail on that. It's all classified. Well, it was all BS. So, I mean, you have to take the history of American intelligence, to understand, what was actually happened with that testimony. It's the same old nonsense. They speak a great deal of nothing. They don't go on to, the track record is obvious. They drop the ball, they drop the ball, they drop the ball. The question should be, what are you doing to avoid the mistakes you've made in the past that we know about, that are real, that are not hypothetical? Because if you are still going to keep on going the way you've been going, what's the point? I mean, like the red line in Syria, when the Assads used their chemical weapons. They're using them again. The UN put out another report. Nothing. They're still basically, the legitimate state in Syria, and Russia and Iran are trying to, finesse the media into believing that, hey, we should leave the Assads alone. They put down their rebellion. Although even Al Qaeda is pointing out the rebellion put down itself because of infighting among, Islamic terrorist organizations. So, there we are with terrorism. Terrorism in itself, as a lot of people point out, doesn't cause a lot of deaths in the West. Most of the deaths are Muslims, Muslims. But the problem is they terrorize. They frighten people, and they should. I mean, people, for example, don't like to fly, even though flying is the safest statistically. A lot of people just aren't impressed with the statistics. They say it's just unnatural, getting up in this metal tube and gliding along and bumping around and what have you. I'd rather, drive in my car, which is much more dangerous. So, yeah, we're dealing with human nature and psychology here. But the problem is, if you're going to talk about solutions, then talk about what happened with failures in the past, and there have been plenty of them. And that's what you don't get out of Mr. Coates and his ilk.
The terror threat as portrayed, mostly if you go and read the document, more so than the discussion that took place in the Senate Intelligence during the testimony, is looking at that fact that Islamic militant terrorist organizations such as the Islamic State and Al Qaeda still maintain some great degree of ideological attraction for a certain kind of down and out, these are my characterizations, down and out young Sunni Muslim man who doesn't have a lot of prospects, and the prospect of helping create the global caliphate becomes the goal in his life. That is tough to address. That's it's psychological, information warfare, cultural component. But both organizations regarded as still being threats. Al Qaeda, something on the rebound. Both of those militant Islamic organizations are entwined in it to some degree. And about 6 or 7 ongoing wars, not all confined to the Southwest Asia or Africa. They've still got a presence, of course, as we've talked about, in the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, and cropping up again in Bangladesh. Terror is a tactic, of course. We've said that, and it is. You're never going to eradicate it. But the intelligence focuses on how to, what the organizations are up to, trying to determine and get some line on future attacks, particularly attacks here in the continental United States and on American citizens, but also how to break them up and their success. There was no discussion in the unclassified, Dan, about those kind of activities. There probably shouldn't be. Jim says the intelligence community's dropped the ball. Yeah, that's true. Their successes, though, you don't want to hear about. You shouldn't hear about. They didn't go into those. But is terrorism a threat that the U.S. has to deal with? Since 93, yes, actually before that, but 93, the first World Trade Center attack. Were we still on vacation? Yes, until 9/11 in 2001. At times, we've gone on vacations again. Jim brought up the Obama administration's red line in Syria. There's kind of one of these combined, intertwined, where weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, and a malign state actor entwine. Yeah, the Trump administration did launch the cruise missile attack following it was a sarin attack, I think, wasn't it, Jim, that they did the Syrian government launched. Is that terrorism, state actor using WMD, but also the Syrians and the Iranians and the North Koreans have all had liaison, if not direct, operational cooperation with terror organizations. And so to try to separate the terror threat from some of the other functional threat areas is tough to do. But highlighting it, I think, is a reasonable thing to do.
Yeah, but what he didn't highlight was the elephant in the room, and that is that the Islamic terrorism and aggression is a historical fact. It keeps coming back. It's been a problem within Islam for over 1,000 years. They admit it, and they have a solution for it, but it's not acceptable in the West. And it shouldn't be, actually. I mean, the Turks, for example. Why was there no Islamic terrorism except why was there no real Islamic terrorism when the Turks were ruling the Middle East? Because the Turks basically said, oh, I understand. I mean, they became Muslims because it was the religion of aggression. Islam literally is an Arab derivative from the Arab word for submission. So the Turks could understand that. And they said, well, yeah, but if there's a caliphate, you have to obey the caliph. So the Sultan said, okay, we're in control of Mecca and Medina. Anybody who gets, that misbehaves down there gets killed. No questions asked. Turks were very strict in this respect. And they basically put down any, insurrection with quite a bit of, violence is not acceptable today. And that lasted until the 1920s, until the Turkish reformers said, we don't want to be bothered. I mean, a lot of Turks said, this is nonsense. The Arabs, the more hardcore Muslims, which were not the Turks, and were basically the Arabs, and especially in Arabia, in Iran, they say, we don't want any part of these maniacs anymore. And that's one reason why they had the Canal, revolution, as it were, secularization. But once that caliph was gone, people didn't realize at the time, because it wasn't fashionable to recognize what was staring you right in the face, that the genie literally was out of the bottle. And once the genie got a hold of what basically came down to $1 trillion worth of oil income, everything was changed. The Arab world didn't become more educated. It didn't become more democratic. It didn't become more economically advanced. But it did basically spawn, the ways and means for hundreds of thousands of young, as Austin pointed out, Arab men who were frustrated with their ineffective, corrupt governments to find somebody they could strike back at. And they suddenly had money. They had the internet. They had, cheap access to the West. And they said, well, hey, let's show those infidels, what they're up against, and boom. But basically, it's chaos within the Islamic world. Now, the Saudis, to their credit, they recognized this early on. And nobody seemed to catch the irony that when all these millions of refugees were coming out of Syria, the Arab states wouldn't accept any of them. She said, no, absolutely not. They understand what the threat is. And now we did that piece recently in Strategy Page about dealing with the widows and orphans of Islamic State, fighters. And the Europeans, especially the French and the Germans, are saying, well, yeah, I guess we kind of do have a problem here. And so they're debating, what do we do with the kids? Did we let them turn into adult terrorists, or do we somehow, put them up for adoption, basically make them non-Muslims? There you go. Nobody wants to admit that. So what's the good of having an intelligence agency if they won't even recognize the obvious?
Before we move on to space, let me give you make a comment on that. One of the things I see, Jim, over the last year, and there was an element of this, not so much in Coates's testimony, but in the Q&A afterwards. And I dropped the word cultural into one of the issues with militant Islamic terrorism, and you expanded on that with the history of it, how ingrained it is with extremist interpretations, let's say, of Islam, is that there's a coming to grips with that by our more open recognition of that, I should say, by the intelligence services. They know that what you said and what I just said as being the case, that there's a cultural component to it. But it was something that we just can't talk about. Well, we can, and this is a subject that we've just glancingly talked about, but we know it's occurring as the attempts of the future Saudi king at modernization, and some of that is addressing some of the cultural and societal issues that make the militant route attractive. And they're going to try to change some of the elements. Let's say, put it this way: societal elements that encourage the militancy. Our intelligence agencies and looks like the government too are more open to discussing those broader cultural and religious elements that encourage militant Islamic terror. I think that's okay, Austin. What are you saying? We knew that 30 years ago, but the government wasn't talking about it in the open. Let's go on to threats from space and let Jim tell us about that.
Okay.
Threats from space have been there since the beginning, and there was a demilitarization treaty about space. For example, we had all sorts of weapons. I think the most interesting was the ones where you could carry a missile on a jet fighter. We covered it several times. Like, the name escapes me at the moment. But anyway, basically,
it was an ASAT that we put on an F-15.
Yeah, exactly. No, I know. I just forget the name of the program. The Russians had it. We had it. We had the best one because we had the better technology. We tested it, but basically we didn't, field it because basically we had no real competition. Well, yeah, we had the Russians, but the Russian satellite system, the technology was very primitive. It still sort of is. And I mean, you can see that it wasn't just hypothetical. The how should I put the unreliability of their satellite networks, but you saw within the space of like 5 or 6 years after the Cold War ended, and they basically had no more money they could borrow to constantly put up replacement satellites and what have you. Their satellite networks were poof, they were gone. Just like that, because you have to keep putting new stuff up. So yes, there's a threat because the Chinese are smarter. The Chinese, you still got a Chinese communist dictatorship over there, but they basically allowed free enterprise to a large extent. I mean, it's not as free as in the West, but that's another story. But it was enough, let Chinese entrepreneurs go crazy. And they basically are putting up, world class, satellite technology up there. And of course, they're also talking about, how to knock the stuff down. Anti-satellite systems. So there's nothing new there. It's just a question of now there's a real threat with China that we didn't have with the Soviet Union. And what are you going to do? Well, basically, you have to build enough systems to threaten their satellite networks, have backup, plans, as it were, to run without the satellites, which I see there are plans, or they're actually being carried training in the United States military to basically assume the satellites are gone. The military, the Marines are always more practical, but it's because they haven't got a lot of money to throw at problems. They are now, concentrating on training with pre-satellite, shall I put it, ways of finding your way around, not depending on GPS. And this is something that the Army, in particular, has always been resistant to. It was a problem during the Cold War. The Russians had fairly low-tech jamming equipment. And I asked them, because I was their war games expert for a long time. And I asked them, why don't you test? They say, well, the answer was basically, well, we don't want to embarrass ourselves. And I heard from people in the military who wrote me letters saying, yeah, we accidentally jammed just for the heck of it. I mean, there's a couple of enlisted guys deliberately jamming jammers during a field exercise and shut the whole thing down and said, oh, sorry, sir, hit the wrong button. But, the message was received. A lot of officers said, why aren't we addressing this? Well, nothing really really happened with that, because eventually the Cold War ended without it actually being used. But now we're in a new situation where the electronic warfare, the jamming, the anti-satellite, capabilities are still there. And, are we, is anybody at the top of the food chain saying, yes, we're going to be practical about this, and we're going to do thus, and thus. If you don't do that, you're in trouble. If you do that, you might get in trouble, with the media saying you're being alarmist, et cetera, et cetera. But that's another problem which I don't believe we're covering.
Just quick comments on that. Jim brought up the GPS issue, not only just shooting down global positioning satellites, but jamming signals, jamming communication signals from space-based platforms. But the testimony Q&A also raised the issue of the proliferation of here's the way I'll put it: proliferation of space-based intel gathering capabilities. And I pointed out in the column I wrote, Dan, that look, your backyard's already available on Google Earth, and that is open. So yours is, Dan, by the way, and even Jim's little backyard.
Yes, I check that every once in a while.
I haven't looked at our yard in a while, but I have in the past. Go ahead and move it. It's
why I'm moving. So
okay, well, that's all right. So you can't be targeted. Well, you can be targeted, and I see that ties back in to terror threat, and then it ties into actually our next section, the transnational crime. You want me to go ahead and move to that?
Yes.
All right. Well, this is something we've talked about a lot. We're no longer month to month covering Mexico, where a lot of that went, but there's still material on it that shows up when Jim writes about Colombia, Venezuela, and actually it crops up in numerous other hotspots around the planet. There was an update, I want to say a little bit over a year and a half ago, about transnational crime moving drugs, cocaine through Argentina, but they were also tied not just to using Argentina as a route, but tied to Argentinian criminal syndicates. These criminal syndicates can be extremely powerful. They prefer, and forget the way that Jim worded this one time that was humorous, but they prefer to buy privacy or something, meaning they're buying off the government, judiciary, and police, so they can conduct their activities. They don't necessarily want to do everything with guns. They'll just do it with money if they can. But the situation in Mexico has evolved, but an example of what large criminal organizations, even when they fragment into smaller criminal organizations, can do to a society. Part of and there was actually very little discussion on this in the open source testimony and discussion that I heard. But criminal activity helps fuel numerous wars. There's a heroin issue in Southeast Asia, also the drug issue in Afghanistan. Same thing goes on in several insurgencies in Africa. And I said Southeast Asia, I think, but the thing is, South Asia, huge issues, and the money that they generate from their illegal activities. That's not all narcotics trafficking. We saw this happen in Mexico, but heavens, it happened in the United States in the 1930s. The syndicates get wealthy and either using extortion or just what looks like honest business deals, buy out honest businesses. Global money laundering is part of it because the transnational criminal organizations, that's one of the activities that they're involved in, but that's also a way that they can penetrate governments and security institutions. So problem, is it necessarily, it's separable in many cases from terrorism and cyber, but cyber attack is a route that is used by cyber thieves. Many of these organizations likely have connections to larger criminal syndicates. I haven't said anything that, note I brought up the 1930s, Jim. Actually, yes. I could have said the 20s and Prohibition, what that did to give the American mafia its stake, its huge monetary stake. But that's it's a problem in the 21st century, and it is integrated into numerous other armed conflicts and also economic issues. I'll leave it at that. What about it, Jim? You got something to say?
Well, the thing that, again, you should look for what is nobody talking about. What aspect of this does nobody want to talk about? And the basic, and we've covered this, and the basic, nexus here, the vector is corruption. The countries that have the most corruption have the most crime. Corruption is a crime, but for example, it eventually came out that major banks were like the HSBC and whatnot were laundering money, for the drug cartels. They paid big fines, but there was no real punishment. Let's send somebody to jail. For example, look at what happened in 2008 with the collateralized debt instrument mess, where it was known that there was massive fraudulent sale of mortgages to people who couldn't pay them, I was a talking head at the time, and the people asked me about that. I says, well, you don't cover stories like this because there's no way to make it sexy. It puts people to sleep. And of course, we had problems with the rating agencies and all the SEC and saying, oh no, everything's okay. So what do? Where's the story? Where's the headline? And then when it went boom, they said, Why wasn't somebody held responsible? Nobody ever was. Nobody went to jail. People paid fines, and walked away. That was corruption. And that's the problem. But again, if nobody wants to talk about it, nobody's going to be doing anything about it. So there we are.
One of the let's tie this back to nation states as well. This was not discussed in what the DNI's at least an open briefing that I heard. I think it may have been glancingly addressed the ties of some nation states to scale organized criminal activity. North Korea immediately comes to mind. We call it a crime state. In fact, as I wrote a column, I think about a year ago, on taking that frame, they definitely make money from organized criminal activity, smuggling, in really globally. But other nation states also have a stake in it. Venezuela comes to mind. A lot of Chinese gangs, which we don't hear a lot about, have connections to Mexican cartels, and that flows through the Philippines. That has been written about a little bit and mentioned on strategy page. So you see how these 5 functional areas, Dan, they interconnect. They're just ways of unfortunately ways of doing what did I say, skullduggery, malign activities and they get back to something that Jim was pointing out earlier. It's and I think he was saying it in the comments on terrorism. It's the intent of the actors and the goals of the actors involved. It's the people involved. It's not it isn't the gun that kills, Dan. It's the person that pulls a trigger, and these are methods of pulling a trigger. Would you agree with that, Jim?
Yes.
That's what they are.
Well, we'll wrap it up there, and we'll talk to you guys next time.
Thanks. Bye. Guys.
Right.